Hey everyone, I'm Patrick Campbell, the CEO and founder of ProfitWell, and this is my course on pricing and packaging. Monetization sits at the intersection of uncomfortable and important, which means most companies just avoid touching it. Yet pricing is one of the most powerful growth levers you can use to grow, so we're going to be demystifying pricing and giving you the tools you need to get your pricing and packaging right. Now let's go through a journey of the course. We're first going to be going through the importance of pricing and give you an introduction to value-based pricing. We'll then talk through pricing research methods. The next module will apply those pricing research methods to develop your pricing personas. Then we'll use those methods to get your packaging and value metric right. And then we're going to answer the age-old question of who should own pricing and how you should communicate pricing changes before finally covering some of the most common tactical pricing questions. All right, let's jump into lesson one. In lesson one, we are going to be talking about pricing's importance and give you an introduction to value-based pricing. Here, we're going to understand a framework for value-based pricing. We're going to learn why pricing is a powerful growth lever, especially in this market. And then we're also going to avoid the pitfall of focusing on tactics instead of monetization strategy. So jumping in, before we get to the meat of why pricing is so important and what value-based pricing is, who in the world am I to talk about this, right? Well, I'm the CEO and founder of a company called ProfitWell. My personal background's in econometrics and math, which means I had a lot of friends as a child, clearly. I started my career working in US intelligence in DC, and then I worked at Google, basically taking a bunch of data and building a bunch of models to hunt either bad guys and gals when I worked at NSA or hunting money when I worked at Google. And then a few years back, I started a company called ProfitWell, and we build revenue automation products for subscription companies specifically. And that's just a fancy phrase for we take a bunch of data, we study it, and then we plug into your billing system and essentially lower your subscription cancellations or optimize your pricing. Now, how do we get all that data? Well, we have this product called ProfitWell Metrics, which is a free subscription financial metrics product that's currently used by about 20% of the entire subscription market. All folks from SaaS companies to subscription e-commerce companies to subscription consumer companies, and it gives us a ton of data, and then the way we make money is we have a product that lowers your cancellations and a product that optimizes your pricing. And so hopefully with that a little bit of ethos established, we can jump right in. And the main reason I'm telling you all this is that when we look at data, not looking at me just kind of postulating or thinking through the logical problem, we're actually looking at real data and know what works and what doesn't based on that data, or at the very least, where you should try to trend what you're trying to do with your business when it comes to pricing. So in order to jump in, let's first start by answering the question, what are you actually trying to do with monetization? And the reason this is a really powerful question to start with is because a lot of us understand that pricing is something that's important. You wouldn't be going after this course unless you thought that already. But also we know that we're buying things every single day. And when I talk to a lot of founders and executives and operators at a bunch of different businesses, when they think of what they're trying to do with monetization, it often fixates on the actual price point. And what I'm here to tell you is that your pricing is actually much more than just that price point. And this is because when you think of your product, and it doesn't matter what type of product you have, it could be a retail product, a software product, could be subscription, could be one-time purchase, doesn't really matter what it is, you've created some sort of value. And because most of the economies we play in, we're not trading brick for wheat or something like that, we basically are saying this value is worth this much in dollars or euros or some sort of currency. And the mental model from this I want you to think about when you think about monetization is your pricing is the exchange rate on the value that you've created in the world. And what this means is that that exchange rate has a lot of influences. If you think about your business, no matter the type of business, everything you're trying to do is drive someone to a point of conversion or to justify the product or the price that you're offering them. And so your price or that exchange rate has a lot of influences. You could influence it by changing that customer that you're going after. All of a sudden, if we go up market, the willingness to pay and the perception of value might go up, or maybe it might go down depending on what that segment looks like. If we go to sell to a completely different vertical, let's say we're selling to dog owners and now we're going to sell to cat owners, all of a sudden the value perception might shift as well because cat owners might be willing to pay more or be willing to pay less. Your actual product, the features of the product, as well as how you actually sell that particular product also influence that value. You can take a feature and move it from a core aspect of the product to something that's an add-on, and all of a sudden the value perception changes. Or even you could just launch that feature and include it across the board, and all of a sudden that value changes as well. And then the final piece, the piece that a lot of people fixate on, of course, your price does matter. Not only is this going to affect the actual conversion rate for your product, but it's also going to affect the perception of your product. If you're a really, really high priced product in a particular market, you might actually look like a premium or a luxury brand. But if you're the discount brand in a market that has really, really high prices, you might not actually be able to attract those customers because they might not actually think your product can do what you're claiming it's doing for the actual price point. And my point here is that all of these different pieces of the monetization journey from a customer perspective are the things that influence how powerful you're going to be with that monetization. Now, to kind of go a little bit deeper here, I know we're very pie in the sky right now. The number that you should be looking at within your business is your revenue per customer. Now, you might measure that in a bunch of different ways: ARPU, average revenue per user, ACV, ARPA. In different kind of retail businesses, you measure this a little bit differently as well. But the big thing here is you want to make sure that that revenue per customer metric, no matter what you're using, is essentially and consistently going up over time. Now, it might not be going up every single quarter, might not be going up every single month, but if you're doing your monetization properly, you're taking it seriously, that number should be going up over time. Now, how do you make that number go up? Well, there's a bunch of things that we're going to talk about throughout the course that you can do, but in actuality, there's some easy things you can do, and then there's some harder things that you can do. On the easy end, changing up how you charge by using something like a value metric, which we'll talk about later, can actually be really powerful. Straight up increasing your prices obviously can increase your revenue per customer, and it's actually easier than you might think. An add-on strategy, one of the most underutilized aspects of any company out there, can actually also be really powerful. But as I mentioned, there's also harder things. You can go up market. This used to be something that was easy 10, 15 years ago, as we'll talk about in a second, or even using feature differentiation, which also used to be easy, but because of the density in the market, is now something that's really, really hard. And neither of these are exhaustive lists, but the point that I'm trying to make here is there's a lot of different things that you can do besides just changing the number. There's so many things you can do to influence that value exchange rate to make this revenue per customer go up and to the right. Now, to kind of close this out, I want to give you a little bit of data to kind of show you that this just isn't me pontificating about the theory of pricing. Ultimately, that revenue per customer is your game, and most of you aren't playing it. To give you some data here, I think the thing I want you to think about is what you think is the average amount of time it takes a subscription company or a company in general to adjust their pricing. Not just the number, but anything to do with their pricing. How often do you think someone changes up their discounting strategy or changes up their packaging? What do you think the distance between those changes are? Have you thought about it in your head? Have you guessed it a little bit? Well, surprisingly, and I bet most of you got this wrong, it's 3 years. This basically means that a company, no matter the type of company, is basically changing up their marketing strategy, their sales strategy, their product strategy, probably every single quarter. But the one thing that measures the essence of their value, they're not changing once, but every 3 years. And to give you some data as why this is so painful, we actually looked at revenue per customer growth over time for a bunch of companies, and we found that the more often you change up your pricing, again, not just raising or changing the number, but just doing other things that have to do with monetization, it correlates with higher revenue per customer. And this seems pretty intuitive, right? Because when you have a number that you're focusing on moving, you're going to move it, and hopefully you're going to move it in the right direction. But as you'll see in the data here, essentially on the top line here, you're looking at customers that basically change something about their pricing every single quarter. They're not changing the price point every quarter, and you notice I'm going to say that a bunch because I get that question a lot, but they're changing something. And their revenue per customer growth is very, very good. Whereas the bottom line here are those companies that aren't changing their pricing once but every 3 years, the average, and their revenue per customer is basically flat. Now, why is this so important? Why now? Well, this is where I'm going to scare you a little bit. The basic idea is when it comes to growth, we are now living on another planet. Some of you might know what this picture is showing. Some of you are too young to understand what this is, but hopefully if you do know what this is, you had a much cleaner closet than this particular picture. But this is a server room. And basically, back in the day, even if you just wanted to have a website, even if it was just a media website, you needed a room that looked like this to basically host your website and make sure that people who wanted to access your site via the internet could basically get access to it in a predictable and also a reliable manner. Now, of course, since then, we all of a sudden have the birth of the cloud, we have the birth of DevOps products, And if anyone watching this wanted to start a brand new company by the end of the day, you could spin up a website, spin up a server, start driving traffic to that website, and it probably wouldn't be an amazing product or an amazing website, but you at least could get started. That was really, really hard 15, 20 years ago, let alone even 25 years ago when we kind of had the birth of the kind of technological revolution. Now, what's been the impact of this kind of ease of getting into the market? Well, simply competition is now rampant. We asked a bunch of different founders and executives how many competitors they had in their first year of business, and what we found is that the average number of competitors most folks had back in the day was around 2 or 3 in their first year of business. We then went to folks who basically started their businesses more recently, and we found that all of a sudden we're pushing double digits in terms of the number of competitors. And this is just because it's so easy to get started, and even if these folks aren't great competitors, they're at least sucking up some of the oxygen within the market, especially when it comes to sales and marketing. And this has given us the most overused slide in any marketing presentation known to man, which is the MarTech landscape slide. And this is the 5,000 different companies that are basically dedicated to helping you grow through marketing and sales technology. And what's really interesting about this slide, and I know it's hard to look at, is that in 2014, the version of the slide only had about 400 different companies on it. And it wasn't because they weren't able to find the companies, there just wasn't as much out there. But now there's just a lot out there. Now, while this is happening, we had a wonderful, wonderful renaissance the past 10 to 15 years, where basically every single quarter we were getting a brand new marketing channel that allowed us to buy Google AdWords for a penny a click, allowed us to target people with retargeting and Facebook ads. But what's happened is a lot of those sales and marketing channels are drying up, or rather, we just haven't had a bunch of new ones. The last major marketing channel that opened up was Snapchat in 2015. And TikTok probably is going to be a good marketing channel for a lot of folks, but not for everyone. And we actually have some data on this where we asked, hey, how many sales and marketing channels were you using back in the day or over time? And basically most companies were only using about 2 to 3 marketing channels 15, 20 years ago. But today they're using 12 marketing channels, but that's flattened over the past 3 or 4 years. So the TLDR here is we're living in this market where there's more competition. We don't necessarily have as many marketing channels opening up that we can flood into for our growth. And as a result of this, we as businesses, we've lost a lot of our power. What we've noticed is because of so much density, customer acquisition cost is up about 70%. And what that means is that customer that might have cost you $100 or €100 6, 7 years ago, it's now costing you $170 today, and they're not necessarily as profitable as before because willingness to pay has actually gone down. The value of products has gone down because software and products used to be magical. You used to be able to put a login screen on a database and you were looked at like a god. Now, if it doesn't have good support, doesn't have good design, and isn't something that was referred from a friend, all of a sudden I might not even give you the time of day. And we actually saw this in willingness to pay data. Over the years, we've measured willingness to pay from 1.2 million different customers, just measuring like what is the value of different features that we normally are selling, and how has that changed? And they've lost about 60 to 80% of their value over time. And the final kind of kick in the mouth here is that our customers are more ungrateful than ever. I don't mean that they don't appreciate your products, but that magic has been lost. And because that magic has been lost, we're seeing customer satisfaction scores and things like NPS have basically gone down. Average NPS 6, 7 years ago was about 34. Average NPS today is in the single digits, and no one's going to stand up and say that products were worse 6, 7 years ago than they are today. Now, this is what's happened in the market, and we can't really control what's happening in the market, but we can control our response. And the problem is that our response has been really, really problematic because it essentially boils down to, hey, let's spend money like it's 2005. Let's go try and buy the market. And that was a really good strategy in 2005, but today it's one of those things that it's really, really hard to do that because everyone's got a good amount of money and everyone's facing these constraints. And just to give you a little bit of context here, what do you think the median expenses for an average company that go to acquisition? So asked another way, how much of a budget of a company do you think goes to acquiring customers, things like sales and marketing? We did a study of about 1,300 different companies, and we categorized all of their expenses, put them into buckets for operations, engineering, sales and marketing, et cetera. And then we looked at what was the proportion that went to acquisition. And you'd be shocked that it's about 57%. And what that means is that 60% of a budget of an average company is going to sales and marketing. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing or something that you should pull back. It's just an indication of just how much we're focused on acquiring customers, and we're still struggling. And the reason that we're still struggling with it is because acquisition is now table stakes. You need to be great at acquiring customers just to survive. We did a study where we isolated the 3 main areas of growth within a business: acquiring customers, monetizing them, and retaining them. And we wanted to figure out if we improved each of them by the same relative amount, what would be the impact on revenue? And what we found is that if you improve your acquisition by 1%, your net new leads, your lead volume, you're going to end up seeing a 2 to 3% boost in your overall revenue. Now, if we improve your revenue per customer, your monetization by 1%, or your retention, how long those customers stick around, by 1%, you're actually going to see a 4 to 8x impact than that of the change of acquisition. And again, this isn't to say stop spending as much money on acquisition. You're probably going to have to spend more money and more time. But this is to say that if you really evaluate how much money and how much time you're spending on these other areas of growth, it's probably a little embarrassing. And just to give you a little bit of an impact here, pricing is a pretty big afterthought. How many hours a year do you think the average company spends on pricing? We actually did this study. And you might think it's weeks, you might think it's one person full-time, which would be a year essentially of one full-time employee, but it's actually about 15 hours. And this doesn't really change based on the size of your company. It does go up a little bit, but not by much. Now, I know that makes everyone feel terrible. I know that this is a really dramatic, like, oh my God, the world is ending type talk with all of the data especially. But the point here isn't, hey, you're screwed. The point here is that we need to take things like product marketing and pricing more seriously within our businesses, because while we always should have taken them seriously, it's one of those things that it's really, really important to take seriously now, because the market has constrained us to the point that this is how we're actually going to survive. Now, how do we fix this? Well, most of us want tactics, right? If we're bringing it back to pricing specifically. Most of us want me to answer, should we end our prices in 9s? Should I just do localization? Should I do freemium? What about add-ons? What about my discounting strategy? And those are all well and good, and we're going to go through a bunch of those in the different lessons throughout this course. But the big thing you have to keep in mind is that it's not necessarily about the tactics. If I just give you some tactics, your core aspects of your pricing are probably going to be problematic, even though you might get some little incremental gains. And so before we get to the tactics, we're going to focus on the strategic bits of pricing. And what this all really comes down to is this whole concept of measuring value, and something you've probably heard before, which is value-based pricing. Now, value-based pricing is where you essentially go out to your customer base, your prospective base, and you actually ask them questions about where their value is. And we're going to go through those questions as well as the objections to those questions in a bit. But the basic idea is I want to go from the customer's perspective rather than any other data. And the reason this is so powerful is because when you look at the other aspects of pricing, cost plus pricing, which you've probably heard of, where you're basically saying, hey, my product costs this much, and I'm just going to put an arbitrary margin on top of it, or competitive-based pricing, where you're just looking at what your competitors have done, these are not necessarily unimportant data points, but they should be basically deprioritized, mainly because your customers don't care about your costs, they care about their costs. And in addition to that, your competitors, I guarantee you, have not done their homework unless for some reason they're doing so much more pricing research, but all of the data that we just showed indicates that they're not. In addition to that, you're assuming you're selling the exact same product to the exact same type of customer, which normally is not the case. And so what we want to do instead is put that value-based pricing data at the center of our business and our pricing strategy, and then look at that as the primary data, and then the costs and competitive data ends up being kind of secondary or tertiary. So if I find out my value-based pricing data says my price should be $100, but my costs are $150 and my competitors are $80, I won't want to put my price at $75, which is the instinct most people will have, or even at $155. I want to go back to the drawing board and realize I probably need to change up my customer a bit. Maybe I need to change up my product. Maybe I'm not describing it properly. And that kind of struggle that I just described is ultimately what you're going to be doing with value-based pricing. Now, the other aspect of this is, again, thinking about your business. The whole goal of your business is to drive someone to a point of conversion or justify the product or the price for that particular product and that particular customer. So if you don't know who this person is, you don't know how they see the value of your product in the world, it's incredibly difficult not only to set up your pricing strategy, but it's also incredibly difficult to just set up your efficient funnel in general. And to give you some data on this, there are some really clear winners and losers in this environment. What we did is we looked at two different types of companies. Those companies where the only lever of growth that was getting better and better was acquisition. Monetization and retention was pretty flat or actually getting worse. And then we looked at companies where all three of these growth levers were improving, not necessarily at the same rate, but at least were improving. And then we measured those two groups as growth rates over time. And as you can see here in the data, basically those who had this balanced growth, the lighter green within this slide, they were growing at a much, much higher rate. And the basic idea here is that it's because they looked at this as the price being the exchange rate on the value that they've created, and they wanted to make sure that they boosted that value over time. So to end this out a little bit, you need to properly measure that value by using value-based pricing. And we're going to go deep in the next lesson of what that actually means and how to actually do that when we go through all of the pricing research methods. And with that, that's the end of lesson 1. Congrats on making it through. We just walked through pricing's importance and an introduction to value-based pricing. More specifically, we understood a framework for value-based pricing. We learned why pricing is a powerful growth lever, especially in this market, and we avoided the pitfalls of focusing on tactics instead of strategy. Now, in terms of an assignment, what I want you to do is do an audit of your current pricing understanding with your team. And your team might just be you with your company, or you might be in a giant corporate where you have to do a little bit of digging of what's going on with your pricing. Find out things like, when's the last time you've actually changed your pricing? How did you change your pricing? Who is in charge of setting your pricing? And ultimately, what is the process through which you're actually changing pricing in the future? Then I also want you to read the first 2 chapters of my pricing strategy guide that covers these concepts even more in depth.